Hi, welcome to Family History Today, the Center for Jewish History's monthly series of genealogy-themed programs. My name is Moria Amit, and I'm the Senior Genealogy Librarian here. The Center for Jewish History provides a collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. I would like to thank one of the organizations here, the Leo Baeck Institute, for co-sponsoring this program. The center also houses the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute, which strives to connect researchers to the wealth of genealogy resources at the center and to make family history accessible to everyone, including researchers of all ages, abilities, and levels of experience, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. The Genealogy Institute is open Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. At the Institute, you will enjoy access to our genealogy databases and reference books with our librarians on hand to provide guidance. While we welcome walk-ins based on availability, we still recommend that you book an appointment at least one day before your visit at libraryservices.cjh.org. If you're unable to visit in person, you may schedule a free 45-minute Zoom session with one of our genealogy librarians, or email us to ask for advice on your research questions by writing to gi@cjh.org. In addition, you may continue to engage with us online in the following ways. Watch our genealogy coffee break videos for brief tutorials on various topics on the Center for Jewish History's Facebook page and YouTube channel. There are over 60 videos available now, and we continue to add a new video each month. Lastly, check out the Center's program calendar at programs.cjh.org to find and register for future programs in our Family History Today series. I have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. You will notice that the chat has been disabled, but we ask that you please send us your questions and comments anytime during this program by using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Please note, however, that our guest speaker will be answering your questions during the dedicated Q&A portion of this program after the presentation. This program features live captions, which have been made possible through the support of the Institute for Library and Museum Services. If you'd like to view the captions for this program, click on the closed caption or CC button on the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitles. Finally, this program is being recorded. In 3 to 4 weeks, you'll be able to watch the video on the Center's YouTube channel. Our speaker has also provided a handout to accompany this lecture, so you will all be receiving that handout tomorrow at the email address that you registered with. Okay. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Alex Calzareth is a genealogist focusing on Southwest Germany, the Czech Republic, and Southern Italy, who began researching his family roots 25 years ago. Alex is JewishGen's research director for Germany. He is also a board member of Reclaim the Records and the Jewish Genealogy Society of Long Island, or JGSLI, and serves as JGSLI's webmaster. So Alex, hi and welcome.
Hi.
Let me just make you, let's see, there we go. So thank you for joining us, and please feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to be doing this out my video due to some technical issues. So let me just get my screen shared. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to be talking about finding overlooked clues in German records. And when you think about German records, you may think of the vital record that you see here, but there are a wide variety of records. That's just one archive on the right. Germans created a lot of different record types, and you'd be surprised what still survives. Today's talk isn't about finding those records, but instead about getting everything out of the records that you already have or the ones that you may find in the future. So we're going to go over understanding the records, analyzing documents, vital record clues, clues from your family's surnames and given names, and finally, we'll see if we can connect together the Jewish family's Amigos Baden using a bunch of different example sources. So to understand the records that you're working with on a day-to-day basis as you do your family tree, you may think to yourself, it's great that we have the records, but why do they exist? They exist because they, being the vital records, censuses, property, probate, and other governmental records, are there because there were various laws and regulations in effect at the time they were created. There were some governmental or Jewish community that said, we want to track economic activity or vital statistics. And if you don't understand the history, you may not understand why your person is there or why they're missing. We're also going to go over how it's important to read and understand titles, introductions, headers, and any available instructions. And we'll also highlight why you should browse through records so that you can think of, were they all written at the same time, or is there different handwriting or updates added later? Because if you don't understand how the records, why they were created and how they were maintained, you may come to the wrong conclusions later on. So to start with, why should you read the introduction and any record set notes? You may think of an ancestry database or Find My Past or My Heritage. Usually they'll explain how the database came about, where they got it from, and there may be other important clues about that data set. The example I'm showing here is from the 1939 German minority census, which is posted on tracingthepast.org. And the minority census really was an all Germany census, but they only retained the records relating to families that had Jewish members in their household. So let's say I'm looking for the Kahn family, a pretty common German Jewish surname, and they lived in Köln or Cologne. I type in the name Kahn into the search box on this website, and I put in Cologne as well, and I find that I get no results. That seems pretty odd. So I take a look at the handy map that they have here, where they show all the search results. And if you take a look at Cologne, you'll notice there's nothing really over that dot. So the question is there Tracing the Past? Do they have an incomplete database? Or is there something about the underlying records that I should understand? And so we check out to see if there's any introductory material, and we find this paragraph that I've highlighted on the screen. And it says that it was discovered in the 1990s that the cards are only 87% complete. And the areas that are missing are Thuringia, the Rhine province, the districts of Erfurt and Minden, and several districts of Bavaria. It so happens that Cologne is in the Rhine province. So if I'm looking for someone who lived in that area, I shouldn't expect to find them in this record set. And here they put together a nice map, but it's always important to just read these notes and figure out, am I not finding what I'm looking for because of how I'm searching or because the records just aren't there? Another example I would say is, let's say a database says Germany marriages 1750 to 1900. So it's unlikely that it has every single marriage in Germany during that period. In fact, it probably only has a very small percentage. So if you see a general topic heading, take a look at the notes and see, where does this really cover? Am I going to find what I'm looking for? Another example of reading the introductory material is not just with databases, also with paper records. So this is a list from 1734. It's the tax on Jews in the bishopric of Speyer, which it's in southwest Germany, and it required the Jews to deliver a certain quantity of wax. The header includes important information for understanding this record. When I found these records, I was excited. I said, oh, look, there's Jochum and Wolf. I know these people, and it looks like a census record. Except when I read the header, you see that the husband and wife had to deliver 2 Handelspfund, or trading pounds. And there were 32 lots in a trading pound. The sons, daughters, maids, or servants who were older than 12 years had to deliver 24 lots, and children aged 7 to 12 delivered 16 lots. So if you browse through these records, you'll notice there's maybe 20, 30 pages of these. You'll say everyone has an amount that they owe, meaning that if no one had to pay if the child was under 7, were there no children under 7? No, that just means they were excluded because they weren't relevant for carrying out this particular government tax. In addition, from reading that, because the amount corresponds to the age, for instance, for Wolf, you'll see that his son Yakov is only delivering 16 lots. That means he's between 7 and 12. Since we know it's 1734, we now can say, oh, now we have an approximate birth range, 1722 to 1727. So by reading that header information, we get another level of detail. In addition, I always like to take the step whenever I approach something new or that I haven't looked in a while to just browse the records. If it's paper, you can just flip through them a little bit. If it's microfilm, let's say on the Family Search website, you can look at the small images like you see at the bottom. I want to get a sense of how are the records organized. This can be more practical for a smaller Jewish community that maybe had a few dozen families versus a city with hundreds of families. Sometimes the title might say births 1810 to 1870, but if you browse through the records, maybe you notice that there's a gap. From 1820, it jumps to 1825. So if this is something that's even indexed, once again, you know something might be missing. And it also gives the opportunity for records to jump out at you. I'm going to go over on the next slide an example, but sometimes, especially in the earlier years, 1810s, 20s, 30s, you're dealing with families that may have not had their surname as fixed as you think they were, or they're using patronymics. And by reading the record, you may say, hey, this is my family, even though when you see a transcription, it might not be obvious. Additionally, with the digital microfilm strip, when I'm trying to go through records, I know the pages with a little bit of text are either title pages, or maybe they're an index page. And the pages that have more text are the actual birth, marriage, death record, or whatever you're browsing through. So here is an example it's pulled from 2 or 3 different record sets concerning the same town of Untergrumbach. And we have the family of Falkbeer. So in this area, you have to say why or when would their names change? And this town is in Baden. So surnames are adopted in 1809. Before that time period, I expect to just see Falk, son of Nathan, Falk Nathan. And after that time period, I expect to see Falkbeer.
Alex, sorry to
You see in
interrupt.
1805 that Falk
Alex,
is marrying
can you hear me?
Hela, who's the daughter of David Hirsch.
Alex,
Then later we find a son being born, a daughter, Reinle.
I just wanted to let you know that, can you hear me? Alex?
Sorry, yes?
Your audio is kind of coming in and out and a little staticky at times. Is there any
Okay.
way that you can
I'm
change the
gonna.
microphone?
I'll try doing it from my phone and muting this.
Okay. Thank you.
Need to. Is this any better?
Sorry. Yes, this is better.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. So when so there's the daughter Bakainla, and you'll notice no mother's name is mentioned there. But it's 9 months after the marriage. If you were scanning a list, you might not pick up on that record. Then we move into the period after surnames. You'll see that Kela becomes Köhler. When you see name differences like that in that time period, it's the same name. They're pronounced similarly. So I wouldn't be concerned with that. Then you even see that they keep having children. 1828, Kayla now has a surname Dreyfus. You may say, is this the same wife? It is. What I know from additional research is that her brothers adopted that surname. But if I was just doing a search in a transcribed database, I might not pick up on that all 4 records belong to the same family. So if you browse through the records, you can say, hey, this record actually belongs to the people I'm looking for. And moving on, just to have in the background as you do your document analysis. I know when I started research, and even now when I find something new, I see the main names. It's said, okay, I have a birth record. I'm going to extract the name of the child, birth date, the parents, and then you say, well, who came before that? But I want to share some ideas that should be in the background as you approach records in your family tree. Think about the record creation process. Who would have provided the information? Was the information verified against any other sources at the time, or was the informant's word taken at face value? Consider revisiting the sources you already have, especially if it's been years since you last looked at them. An address, witness, name, or other small piece of information may mean something more to you now. Also, think about whether you're working with the best available record. Our goal should generally be to get records created as close to the time of the event as possible. Obviously, that's not always feasible. And the further you go back, the scarcer the records are. So you may find a record and that's the only record that's going to give you the answer. But if you're dealing in more modern times, hopefully there is a record created at the time of the event compared to a recollection by someone many decades after the fact. And let's look at how some of this plays out. So here's a record set I'll call generally compiled genealogies. And many towns in Germany, many of you may have encountered this, have Ortsippenbücher or Familienbücher, which essentially mean town lineage books. It means the compiler went through all the civil records, and they may have had access to more records than you can actually get today. They went through all the Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish records, hopefully for a town. Sometimes they didn't include the Jewish records. And when I started my research, there was a book for the town where my great-grandparents were born, and I just copied everything out of there. I said, oh, this is great, and it was a big help. You should definitely access one of these books if they exist, but use it as a guide to further your research. And I'm going to show you one of the entries for my ancestors. This is for Kaufmann Stahl, who was married to Libet Oppenheimer. You'll see that the record says that her parents were Meyer and Bonle, and that they were from the town of Freiburg. And for many years, that's what I had in my database. Eventually, I decided to research this line further, and I went to go look up what records exist for the Jewish community of Freiburg, at which time I learned that Jews were not allowed to settle there until the mid-1800s. And that meant there was a problem somewhere. So I did what I maybe should have done many years before, and I went back to the original record. This particular record is pretty hard to read, but I've transcribed it. And then I've extracted the important pieces of information on the right side. But the important thing is that it clearly states that she's from the town of Ladenburg. Freiburg is half an hour south, Ladenburg similarly in the same direction, but north. Same, the same amount of miles or kilometers, but north. So they're not really near each other. But Ladenburg was the right town. And when I went to those vital records, I found the right people. So if you have a compiled genealogy, check the originals, especially when something doesn't line up. You may also be lucky enough to have a family tree. This is for another branch of my family. It's the Ahnenfolge der Familie Getzel aus Glogau, or the ancestors of the Getzel family from Glogau. And this was prepared in the 1930s. You see the extract of the family tree in the white. And so I had that, and I said, I want to check the original records. So to do that, I said, let me take a look at Family Search and see maybe they have something there. On Family Search, I found that there was this 1812 list of Jewish families living in Glogau, which is today in Poland. And when I saw that list and compared it to the family tree, I said, this must be one of the sources. The information lines up fairly well. The birth dates match, and that this is, now I'm more confident in that information that I have on the family tree. And then I took another look at the family tree and I said, a lot of these people die in Berlin. Ephraim and Rebecca, the parents, and one of their sons, Moritz. And I did other research, and the family did move to Berlin. So the next step was, what information is available on this family in Berlin? I repeated the same process of going back to Family Search, looked at Berlin and what there was for Jewish records. And luckily there was a register of Jews that covered a time period when the family was living there. And it looks somewhat similar to the record from the other town, but it has more information. So by going back to the original records, hopefully there's something else, or at worst, you're just confirming that you're not following a detail that's really a transcription error, or inverted dates, or misplaced family members. On the lower left side, I have a summary of the family from the Gottschalk family tree. You can see Ephraim married Rebecca. Their children are Isidora, Hannah, Rachel, Selfina, Moritz, and Ernestina. But when you look at the Berlin record, you find that there's actually even more information. Here, I see that Isidore married Rosetta Harris, and it has the name of a few of their children. Rachel is not there, but there's a Rosal in the same approximate order, so that's probably a match. Serafina's missing. Her age also doesn't fit really with the rest of the family, so we have to consider, did the compiler of the family tree assign her to the wrong family? It's a point for further research. We get Friederike, who is missing from the family tree. And interestingly, we get Löwy, who later became Leopold. And the note that you see on this record is that on March 12, 1836, he converted to the Lutheran religion. I suspect that that may be the reason that he is not in the family tree, but he may have descendants, and that's another point
for research. So a compiled family tree, the Leo Beck Institute has many of them. There's a project on JewishGen that indexes some of them. They're a great place to start, but as I said, we want to get closer to the original records. So always say, hey, can I get the original? Sometimes they don't exist anymore and the family tree is your best source, but just keep that in mind. For vital records, a lot of what we deal with is the standardized vital records. They were introduced in Germany in the 1870s, some in 1870, some closer to 1875, 76. However, some large Jewish communities had their own vital records before 1800, such as Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hamburg. Other regions started at various points in the 1800s. Here I have a few: the Rhineland and the Pfalz in 1798, Baden around 1810, Württemberg in 1808. They have these great family registers, one of which is shown on the right, which list parents' names and get you back frequently into the mid-1700s. Bavaria started in 1813 with the Judematrikel, and in Hessen, they basically started 1820s with earlier dates for some specific communities. And when you look at these vital records, they have the same format, like I said, once they got standardized, but in the earlier period, there may be similar notes, but they're hit or miss. And I just want to go through two of these records to see what you can learn from the marginal notes. So we have the standard form. It says the father is reporting the birth of a child from his wife. But at the bottom, you'll notice that there's, on the left, there's 3 stamps. And I've translated what they are on the top in the middle. So the first is marriage. It's saying this child who was born 1896 was married for the first time in 1929. And it says that record can be found in the Altona 2 district. He presumably got divorced or his wife died, as there's a second marriage. And that number is 809. And that was in 1935 and in Hamburg district number 20. The final notation is for death record number 1195 in 1939 in Hamburg. So by looking at his record, we really get an indication of how his life further progressed. These notes aren't always there, and there's certain rules about when they're there and not. But if you see this, you should figure it out. And then you can probably go to the city archive, the state archive, or the civil registry office itself to find out more. We also see an 1895 Hamburg marriage record. This is for the child's parents. And the note that I want to point out here is that the parents divorced. So you'll see a few lines, and I've translated it at the bottom. It says, through the judgment of May 15th, 1901 of the Civil Chamber of the District Court of Hamburg, Berthold Eugen Fedor Geider and Anna Charlotte Geider are divorced. In certain archives, you might be able to still get a copy of their divorce record. Not in Hamburg. They didn't save those records generally. But it still is a clue that I need to, if you're looking for the mother, that there may be a remarriage, or even the father. Who am I expecting to see him living with if there's a census record or something like that? So anytime you see a marginal note, do find out what it means, because that's going to be your clue to the next step of researching that person or that family. And there's one type of special marginal note that pertains to something that many of you are surely aware of. The Nazis forced Jews to take the name Israel and Sarah. Oops, sorry about that. And the translated language of that decree was, insofar as Jews have given names other than those which they are permitted to bear according to Section 1, they are required, as from January 1st, 1939, to take an additional given name. Males will take the given name Israel, females the given name Sarah. Berlin, August 17th, 1938. And what you may not be aware of is that this was a very bureaucratic process. The individual who had to adopt this additional name had to write a letter to the Standesamt or civil registry office where they were born and where they married. And those letters survive in some rare cases. But what it tells you is that if, for instance, on this record, that marginal note was added on January 26, 1939. That means as of that date or shortly before, this individual, Mathilde Wertheimer, was living in Germany. We don't know exactly where, but had she died before this date or if she had emigrated before this date, this notation would not be there. Following the war, there was a process whereby the civil registry offices were supposed to go through each and every record and indicate that this was stricken. That took several years, and I've seen some cases where it never happened, but in general, it is something that happened. And just one additional note, there is a list of names that were considered, unfortunately, they were considered Jewish in the sense that they did not add the additional name. So I have an Anselm who changed his name to Anshel because Anshel was considered a Jewish name. And a lot of people, just staying on vital records and a situation that develops in Berlin, Berlin can have multiple copies of the same record. And this also affects cities that are today in Poland. And I guess I should say every place has multiple records, but usually they're kept exactly in sync. So if a marginal notation is made on the primary record, eventually within a year or two, it's made on the secondary record. Because of the aftermath of World War II, Berlin had a different situation. They had their primary registers in some case were in East Germany, and West Germany had access to the secondary registers. So West Germany declared that the second register, would now be the first registers. And so additional marginal notations were made in those records and not in the primary registers that were now in East Germany. And we'll take a look at the examples of what that led to. So today, those records are together again, but it means that they're the same record, the first copy and the second copy may have different notations. Before I go into that for this particular record, I just want to note that the primary register or the Erstligiste is the only one that has original signatures. So if you look at the signature block on the left side, you'll see the signatures vary. But if you look at it on the right block, that's from the second copy, and that's the scribe, the civil registry official's handwriting, Blix in this case. So it doesn't tell you anything about the person. If you're trying to compare someone with a common name and trying to differentiate between the people based on signatures, if you're looking at a secondary copy, that's not going to help you. In this case, what happened is the couple divorced, and that's what you see on the left top. It's a indication that they divorced in 1931. That should have made its way into the secondary register, but that never happened. On the other hand, the secondary register includes on the bottom the note in 1950 removing the name Israel that the Jews were forced to add. The first register never had that notation removed. So even though you're going to get the same biographical information, the additional notes are different because of the history of these registers after the war. And duplicate records were not just something that was started in 1870s. They also existed frequently from the start of the vital records. So for instance, the Jewish community may have kept one set, but there was a duplicate set kept by a parish priest. The Jewish community may have had one set and the district court had another set. So once again, this just results in differences in what the information may contain. This is an extreme example from Breton and Baden, where the summary form from the Jewish community just includes the date, the bride and groom, and their parents. But the full register actually includes the rabbi's name, the date of the marriage band, and the witnesses. So just something to be aware of when you see duplicate records. The other things to be aware of, or that have helped me in the past, is sometimes one set of records has better handwriting than the others. And sometimes there's marginal notes on the original that were made after the duplicate was submitted. If the duplicate was submitted on an annual basis and the record keeping official went back and noted a death that happened 20 years later, as you can see here, that probably was never added to the second set. The other thing that you should consider is there may be records that are just completely missing from one set or the other. For instance, in the original set of records for the town of Weingarten, I found a list of all the Jewish families living there in 1810 with the exact birth dates of the children. This particular list, which is a few pages, is totally absent from the secondary volume. So if I can access both copies, and it's something that I'm pretty interested in, it's a direct line, pretty close relatives, maybe not my second cousin's grandfather, but if it's really a primary focus of your research, you want to look at every set of the records that is available. Frequently they're the same, but you don't know when there's going to be a clue in one set that's missing from the other. Now that we've gone over some details that you can expect to find in records, I want to talk about names. You'll see I did a cluster of these are common surnames in my family on the left side, common given names on the right side. And names themselves, just looking at your family tree and the names as they pass through the generations can be a clue all on their own. So as I mentioned earlier about Baden, but here's a list for a further area. Jews adopted surnames at different times. Some families had them in the 1700s and potentially even earlier, but most did not adopt them until there were decrees stating that it was required. In the 1790s, you can find surnames being adopted in Breslau, Glogau, South Prussia, New East Prussia. 1807 to 1816 period, which in some cases coincides with Napoleon, is when surnames were taken in Frankfurt, Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt, Brandenburg, Silesia, East and West Prussia, and Hesse-Kassel. Hanover and Württemberg waited until the 1820s, and finally Posen and Saxony didn't adopt surnames until 1830s. And the best source for any investigation of a German Jewish family name is Lars Meg's book, which was published by Avotenu and is called The Dictionary of German Jewish Surnames. And here we'll see why that can be such a great source. So you may say, can just a surname really tell me where my family is from? And the answer sometimes is yes. So let's say that all you know is that your great-grandparents were born in Germany, your great-grandfather's name is Wimpheimer, and your great-grandmother's maiden name is Eichtesheimer. So I go to Lars's book and I look up those two names, and I'm in luck. They're very short entries. They were not used by families in many places. So I look and I compare them, and I see they both come from the town of Ittlingen. So that's a great place for me to start looking. Even if I don't have a record that says that, in the United States or wherever they emigrated to. I want to look there because there's a good chance I may find my family there. On the other hand, you may be dealing with a typical German Jewish surname like Lowenstein. As you can see here, that family name was used in dozens of places, if not over 100, and it was from areas throughout Germany. So you can't really narrow anything down just by knowing that one name. But however, even maybe you have a region that they're from. So that entry could still be helpful because you could still maybe pick out 10 towns in that region where they're from, and maybe you could target your search a little better. But if you're stuck on where is this family from, definitely check out Lars Meng's book. Another element of names that not surnames, but you encounter this in gravestones and potentially in Jewish communal records, if they still exist, many don't obviously, is the family member a Kohanim, Leviim, or Israelite? And here are just 3 examples where I'm pretty confident in the termination. So obviously for the Kohanim and Levites, you see the symbols associated with them. So that's obviously a big giveaway. And if you read the Hebrew, on the first one, you would see Yekutiel, son of Shimeon HaKohen, the Kohen. In the middle, for the Levite, you see the name is Yaakov, son of Issachar HaLevi. And on the last one, you just see Abraham, son of Issachar, and no symbols. My basic assumption is that, at least in Germany, especially when the family was more religious, if they have a Hebrew epitaph or have gone to the trouble of putting the Hebrew name onto the gravestone, they were almost certainly aware of their status. Obviously, further generations after they became secular may not know, but if your family is a Kohen or a Levite, this is something you should make note of because it may be relevant in determining kinship later on, and I'll go over that here. So here we have 3 men who have the last name Wertheimer. They're buried in different cemeteries in the Baden area. Bruchsal is a larger city, Bretton's a city, but somewhat smaller, and Eichstätten is I would say, a smaller town. And if I read their gravestone inscriptions, I see that their names are, from left to right, Eliyahu, son of Eliezer HaLevi, Shlomo, son of Shraga, and Betzalel, son of Yehuda HaLevi. And that means that the first, Ernst and Solomon, are both Levites, but Siegbert has no indication. So if I'm, for some reason, think that Solomon and Ernst may be second cousins, that their grandfathers on their father's side were brothers, that's a possibility. But chances are that Siegbert, even if he's somehow related to the other Wertheimers, is not going to be related on a male line. So if you have 2 people and you think they're first cousins and their fathers were brothers, if one's a Levite and one's a Kohen, something's wrong. So it's just something that you need to keep in mind, and it could potentially help you separate or track your families by just taking a closer look at their gravestones. So that was obviously for males. Women also have what I call shifting maiden names. And this is something that I find for women who were born in the late 1700s, I guess even mid 1700s, and they got married before surname adoption. So different records pertaining to the same woman will give different names. And here's 3 of them. I'm going to go over them in more detail on the next slide. But here you see the names are Judle, ne Jacob, Judle, son of Yaakov, daughter of Yaakov. And on the last one, it's no name, but ne Stein. And when you're looking at this shifting maiden names, in this case, Judle was married to Herz Löwenstein, and they had 8 children. If you consider that each child has a birth and death record, and some of them have marriage records, along with Jutla and Hertz's death records, there may be more than 20 records that provide her name. And so Jutla's father's name was really Jakob Wolf, and he was from Mingelsheim. Her brothers adopted the surname Stein in 1809. So that caused her to be referred to, as you can see, she was referred to in one record as just Judith Löwenstein, no maiden name. Judla, daughter of the deceased Jew Jakob from Menzelsheim, Judla ne Jakob, Judla ne Wolf, and as I said, no first name, but ne Stein. So this all depended on how did the person recording the event ask the question, and what did the family member providing the information know. But even if you didn't know who her father was, I would start looking for people named Jakob Wolf, Wolf Jakob, Jakob Stein, Wolf Stein. So it's giving me a clue. And when I see two different first names, I say, hey, maybe put those names together and I'll get the father's patronymic. And I may not know the order, and there's other ways that you can start figuring that out, depending on what order were the children named in, which is something I'm gonna touch on in a little bit. So moving to given names, sometimes there are clues hiding in plain sight. As most of you know, Ashkenazi Jews name after deceased family members, meaning that if you can figure out where a given name comes from, so to say which part of the family, it gives you clues as to the names of earlier generations that you might not have in other sources, or might have trouble connecting to the present generations. So in this chart, I just want to show how progressions of names sort of worked in my own family. So before 1800, let's say 1750, they had traditional or names. So Berla, Herz, Simon, Edel, Michle, Jütle. But by the mid 1800s, as there was more assimilation or just more connection to German culture, the names started to change. So Berle went by Bernhard, Herz by Hermann, Edel by Emilia or Adelheid. So there was a connection, it was similar, but it wasn't quite the same name anymore. And then what I find in my family and in others is by, let's say 1920s, 1930s, that the family names may still be there, but they're probably a middle name, or sometimes, as in the case of, this is my great uncle, Heinz Siegbert, his Hebrew name was Shimeon, so he's named after Simon, but now just the S is representing that in his name. So, because I always take a look at my family trees and I say, what was the history of this name? How was it passed down from earlier generations? And if you don't have access to someone's Hebrew name, this is a way just to consider, are the names that look like they're new names really just more modern names, at least in the family's consideration. Before the mid 1800s, I also look out for less common names. One of my favorite names in my family is Lekush or Lekash. It's a pretty rare name. If I see that somewhere, I'm going to say, are they connected? There's Gerson, Kalman, Bonle, and maybe that's a common name in your area. But if you're in an area where that's uncommon, pay attention to that if you see it in a neighboring town, or just because that could give you the clue that maybe that part of the family is originally from that town. And maybe that town has better records. So don't discount that names, obviously surnames are passed along just on the male from father to son, then to daughter, and then they usually change to a married name. But given names also have a path back, and following that can enhance your family tree research. You may also say, how do I know how common this given name is, sorry. So I would recommend Alexander Bader's A Dictionary of Ashkenazic Given Names, Their Origins, Structure, Pronunciations, and Migrations. So for instance, you see the name Lakish on the right side that I was talking about. He found that name in very few sources. Compared to the name Aaron, that is coming up in, it has three columns. It shows up obviously in many places. I'm sure there's other references that he didn't even include. So just looking in his work will give you an idea of, is this a name I should be paying attention to, or is it so common that it's basically, that's somewhat meaningless for my family in terms of tracking down connections of that given name. So here I've tried to conceptualize, and this is also in the handout you'll be getting, how did the parents go about naming their children? So we know they're named after deceased relatives. This chart has more information than I probably would have in a typical situation, but consider if you list out the children. Here there were 3 sons and 3 daughters. Their first child is born in 1825. So we look at what we know about the children's grandparents and great-grandparents, including their dates of death. The first child is a boy, and his mother's father is already deceased, while his father's father is still alive. So in that case, the child received the name of his maternal grandfather, which in this case is Falk. Their second child is a boy, the other grandfather is alive, so he's named for a great-grandfather. However, by the time the last son is born in 1838, his paternal grandfather has now passed away, and so now he can be given the name Liepma in honor of his grandfather. A similar pattern plays out for the daughter's name, although you'll notice Regina isn't there, so you have to speculate and say Rekle, and that's a change that I've seen. So that goes along with the shifting to a more, so to say, modern name. And so that plays out in a similar way. But do keep in mind that if a parent has the same name as the spouse's deceased parent or ancestor, you may not have a child named after that particular ancestor. Also, in this case, Augusta has already been named for her, the mother in this scenario, has been named for her paternal grandmother, meaning that one of her children is not going to be named after that ancestor. So it can be usually frustratingly, you don't have all the answers, but it's still a good way to potentially connect back to a further generation back. And you should also pay attention when there are multiple siblings. I compare, what did they name their children? If there are 5 sons of 5 first cousins with the same name, that should be a flashing light that maybe that's the name of their grandfather. You need to look at the individual facts and circumstances, but it's a good clue. Here, just staying on the topic of names, be aware that of the calques or loan translations. So if you're looking for a Löw or Loeb, in a modern German, you'd be looking for Leopold, but Hebrew could be Yehuda or Aria. Löw means lion in German, and then lion translated into Hebrew is Aria. And the same thing happens with Wolf, Hirsch, and Bear. So this chart is also in the handout. And just, you'll find Wolf everywhere in a vital, all the German vital records, contracts, etc. Then you find his tombstone and his Benjamin. So if you don't realize that these connections exist, you may be looking at a list of burials and it only has Hebrew names. So if you see Benjamin, you may not make the connection if you don't realize that these names typically go together. And here we have an example with the name Löw. So he was Löw in 1818 when he was born. And he's Leopold in German when he dies in 1889. But we see in the Hebrew that he's named Aria. Here's another Löw, my ancestor. I have his signature from a document in the late 1700s. He signs Löw Benjamin. Here's his gravestone, and here his Hebrew name is Yehuda. So just generally, you're not going to find someone named Löw ever, or rarely will you find them with Löw on their gravestone. So now that we've seen those various hints and suggestions about how you could maybe be thinking a step further than what you're reading on the page, I want to go through how I applied this process to push my family tree back another generation or two in the town of Mingelsheim. We start with, as a starting point, here's the 1812 surname adoption list. It's fairly limited. It's in the Bertolt Rosenthal collection at the Leo Baeck Institute. It just says that there's 3 families and the heads are Meyer Hanf, Wolf Oestringer, which should be Österreicher, and Isaac Stein. But that's not the only source. We also have vital records at the archive in Karlsruhe, the tax list in 1734. Family Search has a second copy of the vital records. And there's also another copy in Freiburg at the Archdiocesan Archives, which covers 1811 to 1869 and has the State of the Jews for 1815, which will be a vital record in connecting all these families together. Bertolt Rosenthal worked in Baden and copied a number of records from the archive in Karlsruhe, and also some Jewish community records that no longer exist, such as the case with the Obergrombach Burial Society, essentially accounting records. There's a list of Schutzjuden, or protected Jews, for almost every decade from 1720 to 1790. And there's a list of the Jews in this district in 1785. There's tombstone information on another state archive website. And finally, there's a Mohelbuch transcription. So these are a bunch of different records pertaining to the same people, and let's look at how they could potentially connect. On the left, this is the 1815, what it looks like. You can see that this wasn't a static record. I see different handwritings, different ink shades, meaning that this was something that was updated. I have my family tree printout showing that certain names such as Jakob, Legush, and Sophia Oziele repeated in the family. So we're going to start by analyzing when were who lived in Mingelsheim and when were they alive. So in my first column, I put all the first names. In the second column, I put the different lists. I don't show the 1720, 30, and 40 here, but you can say, okay, they were paying protection fees. They lived there in 1720, in 1730, 1740, and then for Joachim, in 1750, his widow's listed. So now I know that he died sometime between 1740, 1750. And that's a similar process that you can repeat. If you have just even a few years, just laying it out in this chart form can help you get a grasp on who was alive when. So you know if you're dealing with the same person or a grandchild who might have the same name or a cousin, etc. There's only 5 to 7 families living in this town in the 1700s, so this works. If you're dealing with someplace with 100, 200, this type of analysis is probably not going to work, especially before surnames. And even with this, we still need some more records. Here is a transcription of the Mohelbuch that has entries for Mingelsheim from 1695 to 1716. Obviously, we're very lucky to have this type of record. You're not going to encounter this everywhere. I don't have access to the original. I do have access to the transcription. The person transcribing it was very familiar with the names and Hebrew, so I trust their work. And here we see that there's 3 sons of Yochanan, who is an ancestor of the primary family that we're tracking. Furthermore, we have the 1734 list where I discuss the headers. So I transcribed the records, and I see Joachim, which is the same as Yochanan. And we see that he has 2 daughters, Hannah and Böhler, a son, Herzl. And the son, Wolf, who's mentioned in the circumcision register, has already started his own family by this point in time. So he's there as well. And he has a son, Yakov, who we know is between the ages of 7 and 12 based on the headers. Even so, this is another data point that's going to go into my final chart that I'll show you in a bit. Finally, we have the 1785 list of Jews in Mingelsheim. And this list is a result of a requirement that all protected Jews in the bishopric on this and the other side of the Rhine needed to be compiled, listing how many sons and daughters each has and whether they've married abroad, and if not, how old they are. So this list is now close enough. We're only 30 years until that 1815 list that has all the Jewish families in town. So I can start listing those families in 1815 and see if I can find a match in 1785. Obviously, their surnames in 1815, 1785, we're still in the patronymic era. So, but I see Jakob Baum's widow, née Legush, who has a son, Legush Baum. I know from other records that there's only one Jakob, and that's Yakov. And 1782 son corresponds pretty well to the son that was only 2 years old in the original list. We have Loeb Mai, and there's only one Loeb in the 1785 list. And finally, we have Chaim's widow, and her children have used the name Österreicher, but there's only one Chaim Wolf. So these two sets are close enough together that I can make these correlations. Those are vital records. We also are lucky to have these cemetery lists, which span from 1760 to 1810. Not only do they show when people died and when their tombstone was paid for, but they also indicate when marriages took place, because in this area, you were required to pay a certain percentage of your dowry to the burial society for the right to bury yourself, your wife, and children there. So, for instance, we see Jakob, who has his paid part of his dowry in 1765. So we know he got married around then, maybe a year or two earlier. And then for later on, we see that he dies in 1801. Similarly, for his brother, we see Loeb got married around 1767. He dies in 1778. His tombstone is put up a year later, 1779, and then his wife dies a few years after that. And I've grouped these. So the original transcription was in the chronological order, but I then grouped them into related family units so that they would be easier to analyze. Let's see here. And if the wife dies first, obviously the husband may remarry or vice versa. But I'm getting a picture of the vital statistics, even though we don't have vital records. And just one more very important set that we're lucky to have. The Obergrumbach Jewish Cemetery, unfortunately, was largely destroyed. 25% of the stones still exist in their original location. But a number of the stones that were destroyed were used for water runoff and were later recovered in the 80s and 90s. And it just so happens that two of those stones pertain to this family. We have Yochanan, who was the son of Jakob Yosef from Mingelsheim. And on that other record, we knew he died before 1750, and his widow was alive then. And these two tombstones correspond to that. Yochanan is a rare name. So even though Yetles doesn't say she's from Mingelsheim, it's a good clue. Also, we tie into her father is Benjamin, which meant he probably went by Wolf. And she had a son named Wolf. So, and Yetle is also a family name. So even though we're in the mid 1750s, we're still able to tie it together to other records. And ultimately, in the end, by using the various records, so the Mohel book, the gravestones, the burial society list, the tax list, the list of protected Jews, and the vital records, I'm able to start a tree of someone who may have been born in or was born in the 1600s, Jakob Joseph, and trace him for the son Johanan to his son Wolf, and further from Wolf to Jakob, and then further down.
Alex?
Yes, this is the final slide.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So just my final point I'm going to make here is that the family, if you look at the surname adoption list, you think you see 3 families, but that's not the actual case. The Mays, the Österreichers, the Baums, and the Steins are all one family. And from looking at all these different records, you see that they all fit together. So I encourage you to, I hope this overview gives you an idea of what you may be able to do for your own families, find out what records exist for your towns, extract information from them, and then put them together in an organized fashion to see what overlaps, and you may be able to come to conclusions about family relationships and the dates of family events that you might not otherwise be able to pull from one single record.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. This is very well illustrated, and I think you've given our audience a lot of food for thought, and I hope this enables you to you in the audience to continue with your research and gives you some inspiration about where to look going forward and how to use specific records. I'm now gonna open it up to, or I'm now gonna start asking some of the questions that have come in from our audience. Alex, can you please stop the screen share?
Oh, sure. Yes. Stop share.
Okay. 1 second. Oh. Sorry about that. Okay, no, okay, that works.
Okay.
So first I'm going to start with a comment.
Okay.
Yvonne Stern from Rio de Janeiro says, "Dear Alex, thank you very much for the interesting conference. My mother's ancestors also came from Glogau." So maybe there's some relation there. Okay. I'm going to do some more general questions first and then go into more specific ones. What tips can you give about searching for records from East Prussia?
So unfortunately for East Prussia, the tip that I can give is that I know that there's a lot of record loss. Usually my answer is you need to go to Roger Lustig because he is the expert in that area. And my particular research has not brought me that much there. I always start with Family Search to see what they've collected. Trying to think there's any other general tips, but so Roger Lustig is involved with Tracing the Tribe if you post something there, if you're on Facebook. If not, you can go to the Gersig website, jewishgen.org/Gersig, GERSIG, and his contact information is there. You can just general, there's the JewishGen discussion list and also a Gersig Facebook group. So I unfortunately can't give anything specific for that area, but there are people who do know how to track stuff down there.
Thank you. Let's see here. Were German Jewish surnames, their etymology, were they linked to the family's professions and occupations? Is that a common derivation?
I suppose that could be the case, but I feel like usually, I'm saying you could have a Metzger family, which is a butcher. It is a possibility. The surnames, they generally got to choose their own surnames. So sometimes I can figure out why that was the case. Just for instance, in my family, Löwenstein is because the recently deceased father is named Löw. So,
okay.
So there's definitely a chance of a connection. There are very common German surnames that are occupation based, but my sense is it's not as great. But I would also, if you have a particular name you're looking for, get a hold of a copy of Lars Menk's book, because in addition to the surname list, there's also just a whole general discussion of surnames in the German-speaking areas.
Okay, let's see. Oh, one person asked about what proportion of the records that you use are available online versus only in an archive in Germany?
So luckily, so everything that I showed that's from the Bertolt Rosenthal collection is from Leo Beck, so that's all online. If you're researching the Baden area, you're lucky there. The vital records that I was showing, so Berlin, Ancestry has done a lot of work with large cities in Germany. So Berlin, Karlsruhe, Mannheim, Hamburg, those vital records from 1870 through the 30s, depending on not birth records, but marriage and death, those are frequently online. Otherwise, German archivists will respond to you. There might be a fee. Some of them, like the tax list I was using, that I didn't discuss, I discovered on site in the archive. So you can always try writing the archive that's responsible for the area where your town's located in, and hopefully they'll tell you, they may say we have way too much. But the vital records, and also, sorry, it depends on which part of Germany. So even the Jewish records for Baden-Württemberg, those are online. These archives put them online. If you're talking about Saxony, the archive has put very little online. So just it's depends region by region.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. How does one ever learn to even read the old records?
So I've been doing it for a little bit. So that's something that I should have more readily available. But there is a BYU, Brigham Young University course that, not that it's paid, but they have, if you do BYU German script, you'll find a course that tries to teach you how to read it.
Okay.
There's also, if you look on Family Search has a wiki, so there you can probably find resources there as well. There's books called, I think Edna Benz, If I Can, You Can, something. They could email me for more specific references, but and a lot of it is just practice. If you start with records that you know the families, you'll learn to recognize their names, and then you can learn to recognize the vocabulary. And I also should mention, I taught myself to write it.
Oh, wow.
So that was also a help.
Okay. Let's see. A lot of questions have come in the last few minutes. What are the oldest records of Jews one can actually find in Germany?
So there is stuff that goes back into theoretically into the 1500s, but that doesn't mean you'll be able to connect yourself to those Jews,
right.
And probably even earlier. So at least in the areas I deal with, and maybe all throughout Germany, the 30 Years' War really caused a disconnect of just that a lot of records got destroyed. So vital records, year 1800, maybe mid 1700s, you can get back to. But because Jews were taxed and needed permission to reside wherever they lived for the most part, at least back into the 1700s in the areas I've dealt with, the records were created. If they survive, that's a different question. But I spent recently weeks collecting like pages and just court records and disputes from the 1700s in a certain town. So and obviously then there's rabbinic lines and stuff like that, but just Germany, it's generally a problem of maybe this one town doesn't have it, but this other town I'm interested in has it, and where can I find the time to look at everything?
Yeah, and to make those connections between
Yeah.
what you have later on. Yeah. Oh, Roberta, thank you. She wrote in, regarding writing. I'm assuming she means writing Old German script. And she suggests the website germanologyunlocked.com. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
It sounds somewhat familiar. Yeah.
okay. Oh, somebody else said the same thing. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's see. Very specific question from Doreen. I found a marriage record for my Lerczak, it's Lerczak, ancestors in Preuben in the 1850s. My ancestors were listed as Lerczak, my ancestor, this one person, was listed as Lerczak. However, his parents were listed as having the surname S-U-S. And then in following baptismal records, I found our surname was back to being Lerczak. Is S-U-S a note for something, or is it an actual surname?
So my guess is that Preuben is probably Preußen, maybe, or
yeah,
maybe it is
I'm
or
thinking that too.
Actually, a town. I'm not familiar. So Lerczak makes it seem like you're in East, in the areas that are now Poland, which is, so that sounds Slavic to me. I could be wrong. Zeus is sweet. So I don't know what the translation of Lerczak is, and maybe maybe there's a connection there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all, just off the top of my head, that's what I can say.
Okay, thank you. Oh, what database do you use to organize all your research? I'm guessing they're talking about like a family tree software.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I should give an answer of a program that's still on sale. So I continue to use the Master Genealogist, which stopped being sold in 2016 or so. But
oh no.
Because it still runs. But what I recommend to people today is Roots Magic. I know people have had some issues with version 8. And so I don't know if version 7 is still sold, or I'm not up to date with everything, but that is flexible, just to be able to enter in multiple types of, I guess, multiple possibilities. Sometimes I like to say, oh, maybe there's this birth date or that birth date. And yeah, or there's TNG, which is website based, or obviously, yeah. So, and I store stuff I have a lot of scan files just in a hierarchy, and so.
Yes, it takes a lot of organizing, for sure. It's a lot, but it's highly worthwhile because otherwise.
Yes, and also I like to work things out. Just like when I worked out the last thing, I still haven't entered it in my database yet, but just to get a visual representation before you're more comfortable with your conclusion, sometimes it's easier to just write it out or do a spreadsheet or Airtable.
Okay, there was a slide where you had, I think you were listing all of the different places where you found records for a particular town. There was like a list. There was the Leo Beck Institute, the National Library of Israel, etc. And I think Family Search as well. Is there some sort of source where you can go to find out references for individual surnames, or?
So this is something that I want to exist.
Oh, sorry, not surnames, towns. I apologize.
You know, it's something I very much want to exist. I started something like it at one point, but that's but the thing that's more the successor to that is going to be JCAT, which is an attempt to catalog Jewish records. I think it's Catalog of Jewish Records Worldwide, and that's still in, I guess, a very early stage.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, you sort of have to search. Just go, and I would also like to build this out on the JERSIG website, but for lack of manpower, that hasn't been done.
Are there any Kahila links pages on? No, okay.
So German Kahila link pages there may be like 10 of them.
Okay.
So the thing I like to say for Germany is there were like 2,000 or 3,000 towns where Jews lived in Germany. And you deal with Ukraine, and I think that number might be a few hundred. So in a lot of the towns, there generally were 20 or 30% would be an incredibly high number for a Jewish percentage of the population of a given town. Frequently, you're talking about 2%, 5%. So the further east you are, you have a humongous Jewish community. There's a lot of descendants. For a lot of towns I research, I maybe know one other person who researches that town. So usually when you find your town, it's better to just post a message somewhere and say, hey, can someone help me track down what might be available? But hopefully in the future, there will be places to preserve this type of knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, is there an easy place to find documentation of when an ancestor obtained German citizenship?
So I'm going to say no.
Okay, is there a hard place to find that?
So you generally, if you're talking, I'm guessing that they're talking about the process of reclaiming German citizenship, and that's
Probably.
the reason for the inquiry. So usually I would say, well, if you can find the restitution file, and there is an email address to write to find out if they did ever have a restitution file. And on their application, they'll say what their citizenship was. So that would be a clue already. If they applied for a passport, the passport record might be still in existence. There might be residency registration records that still exist. But there's no central repository. It's not like the US where you could send out in an index search, and if it's after 1906, they'll find it. But if the person wants to write to me, I could at least suggest where to the email address for finding their restitution file, which archive has it, or which office has it.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, there's a number of questions about birth certificates. So can you explain the process of how people can request vital records in Germany?
So sure. The German law is that vital records are private for 110 years for births, 80 years for marriages, 30 years for deaths. Depending on the city or state, they may get moved to an archive after that time, or they might still be held in the civil registry office. Most states, you need to know the exact town where they were born, if we're talking, in order to get a copy of the record. So it's not like the US has like 53 vital records jurisdictions. Each town is its own jurisdiction in Germany. So if it's I would search for a city archive or community archive, Stadtarchiv, Stadtarchiv, and the town name. And you can inquire and say, hey, my ancestor was born on this date. How would I get a birth certificate? I'm sure even if you're in English, they'll answer you. If it's more recent, like some cities like Munich, you can actually ask for it. They have a website. So that's if we're talking about more recent. If it's older, then then usually I start with Family Search to see if they have it, and then check out the regional archive webpage.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. From Tessa. Typically, how often would families stay in the same town or the same surrounding towns over generations?
So that is an interesting question. I just laugh when I think of potentially a very long time, at least from the areas that I deal with.
Okay.
So when I think of like the Czech Republic, they go all over the place every generation. The town where my great grandparents were born in 1900, the ancestor moved there in 1702. So generally they maybe eventually after emancipation where they had more rights, they moved to a larger city. But generally they're in that town, or they found a marriage partner and they moved to a different town. But there's not a lot of crazy mobility where they're in a different place every other year or every few years.
So when would you say the phenomenon of moving into larger cities started, or when did it
I want
really?
to say that's 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, late 1800s.
Okay, thank you.
Is when they really went from the, I guess I'm sure there's people who have family in Berlin, but a generation or two prior and you're back in Poland or places further east. Yeah, so that's, that's what I would usually think.
Okay, so I would like to thank everyone who submitted a question. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to all of your questions, but thank you for being such an inquisitive group. Alex, there are a few questions I would like to ask about you before we sign off. First of all, do you take on private clients?
At this time, I do not.
Okay. And what is there an email address that people can write to you at?
Sure. It's ALCALZ@gmail.com.
I'm going to try to put that in the chat box. So it's ALCALZ.
Yeah.
At
Gmail.
Oh, Gmail. Okay, got it.
I should warn people that I tend to have a large backlog of emails. If you don't hear from me, send another email.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I think we are ready to sign off. So thank you so much again, Alex, for taking me up on my invitation, and and I look forward to having you back in the future. And thanks for everyone who's still stuck around till the end. And I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.